Discomfort-Zone podcast. The idea to cross the ape man with the Anunnaki. Slaves, work animals, created for one person to unburden the gods. Hello, and thank you all for joining me for another episode. Welcome everyone in chat. Let's see. Oh wow, Falcon, Foxon, Patient Zero, Rondon, Revised Sociology, Stiant, and Alien Honey. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. Wow, thank you all for coming. I have quite an episode in store for us today, I have to be honest. It's another thick one. So, you know what? Let's dive right in. Let's go right in. As always, if you have any questions along the way or anything, feel free to post in chat, and then I comment on them every once in a while. So, last week we spoke about basically the tales and the creation of man and part of the history of the Anunnaki leading up to it. And so today we're going to carry on, but first we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the tale of the creation of man and compare it with the Old Testament's Adam and Eve story. So, before we go any further, last week, I can't remember who asked the question, but I think he's not here in chat now, about the timeline. And so I correctly stated that it was 40 Shahs. Each Shah is 3,600 years from the time the Anunnaki landed. I incorrectly stated that it was 30,000 years. That's my maths being off. I was only wrong in one order of magnitude. So that was actually 300,000 BC, around 300,000 years ago. And so that was the point where man was first, the Enki was first beginning the experiments of creating man. The whole process took a long time. And in fact, what we're going to talk about today transpires over around 200,000 years, more or less. And so let's get into it. Until now, the main source that I've been using for the episodes has been Sitchin's first book, The 12th Planet, with a little bit of sort of padding out from his later books in the series, the 6 books that he wrote. But this episode, I'm going to actually be taking from a different book, which is called The Lost Book of Enki. Now, this is a different kind of book from the other that Sitchin wrote. All of the others are really academic in nature and an attempt to pose a theory and to back it up with evidence. In the Lost Book of Enki, however, Sitchin is trying to conglomerate and put together all of the information that we have from the different cultures throughout the ages, and telling the story as a narrative through the eyes of Enki being both the narrator and the protagonist, basically retell the story from the arrival of the Anunnaki and their impact on humanity. And so it's a different kind of book, and I feel it's important to state that the information in here is not backed up in the same way. That isn't to say that it isn't true, only that it is different. So if you want these books, I'm pretty sure are available online as PDFs. The Lost Book of Enki. It's written there's a sort of quick synopsis of Sitchin in his own words, and then the clay tablets translations as they were written. So that's where a lot of this information is coming from. It obviously is conducive. It goes well with the other information from the other books. It builds on that, basically. So, we spoke about the first creation of man. And in that story, as we said, Enki had numerous iterations. And as we've discovered from investigation, Sitchin concluded that the special life essence, the blood of the Anunnaki that was used, was actually their DNA, and that this was some form of genetic manipulation to a very high degree in creating a new species that was a hybrid of the ape man and the Anunnaki. Now, an important point that I will very briefly gloss over, just because it's something to think about. Sitchin talks about this a lot, and this goes into the history of the planet and the far, far history before the Anunnaki were even around. How can it be that the DNA of the ape man was genetically close enough to the Anunnaki to be compatible? If you would think about genetic crossings between alien species, it would be hard pressed to imagine that there would be enough DNA similarity in order for it to be successful. And the answer to this is actually, as Enki discovers during his time on Earth and his scientific investigations, he posits the theory that in the history that's told of the solar system, at one time the Earth was a much bigger planet. And this bigger planet, in the story it's told, was sort of attacked by a foreign object, as it were, foreign planet, and the impact split the larger planet into two, and one of those parts became the Earth's moon, and the other part became what we know as Earth today. Now, this story, which appears on the clay tablets from thousands of years ago, is actually very similar to what the scientific theories about the origin of the Earth. It's pretty much agreed upon that there was some kind of impact in space, and that the moon is actually a part of the Earth that broke off and then came into orbit. Yes, the ape man. Sorry, it's you'll have a few listens to the song to understand. So, sorry, I was just responding to chat. In that impact, the theory is that Earth was a barren land, a barren planet before, and that the planet that crashed into it was Nibiru, and that in that impact, as devastating as it was, that was actually panspermia, I think it's called, an extraterrestrial form of life organism coming into Earth and finding it hospitable enough, basically procreating here and beginning the evolution of life on Earth. And so this both explains why evolutionarily there would be such similarities physically as this sort of hominid, because the evolution was sort of very the same beginnings, although the environment, the surroundings were different, and it was a different timeline because the Anunnaki are obviously at least hundreds of thousands of years more advanced, evolutionarily speaking, but still the starting point, it is suggested, was the same starting point. And it is because of this that the DNA was similar enough for the genetic manipulation to be successful. So, having gotten that small point out of the way, Enki tried and tried again and eventually succeeded in creating a first human, as it were, a hominid creature. And it's described that this creature was very much ape-like and animal-like. And so in the beginning, he was created in South Africa, where Enki's laboratory was and where he was working. And so here we're going to cut to the Adam and Eve story, and we're going to see the Adam and Eve story, and I believe it's quite paradoxical, and yet it with Sitchin's explanations it takes on a very different light. So for those of you who don't remember in its entirety, although it's obviously a very famous story, God created Adam and Eve, and he put them in the Garden of Eden, and he told them that they can eat from any fruit of the garden except for one tree, which was the tree of knowledge. And it's quoted as saying that if you shall eat from the tree of knowledge, you shall die. And then Eve one day meets the snake, and the snake tells her that why doesn't she eat it? And she said, because we'll die. And he says, you won't die. The God, deity, fears that you will become like him or like them. And if you eat from the fruit, you will become like the gods. And so she is tempted and eats from the fruit, and Adam comes and she tempts him. This is all according to the Bible. And then God appears to be wandering around the garden, and Adam hears him and hides, all very confusing for the regular Jewish theology. And obviously God finds him and says, and notices that he's clothed himself and that Adam and Eve have become aware of their nakedness. And he says, I think, what have you done? And he says, Eve made me eat from the fruit. And she said, the snake did. And then he curses all three of them and banishes man from the Garden of Eden, saying he will never be allowed in again. So that's the story that we're told in the Old Testament. And I think it's a little strange because things seem to transpire very, very quickly. Adam and Eve are put in this garden, and they are allowed to live there as they want. And yet, in this garden, there is this one tree, the tree of knowledge, and God forbids them from eating from this one tree which is there. Now, this already is a little bit bizarre, but if we carry on, we see that God, after lying to them, is sort of found out by this lowly snake. So all very interesting, and I've heard a lot of different explanations and theories as to the symbolic meaning behind the story, from psychedelic mushrooms to the civilization of man. And I'm not here to necessarily debunk any of the others, because I do believe in a plurality of truths and understanding at different layers. But after reading and learning the Sumerian version of the tale and seeing the similar points and obviously the extensions and all of the extra information, the story does take on a very different feeling. So, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there is a term which is used, which is sort of knowledge and the verb to know. And in the Old Testament, it's used time and time again to mean to conceive, to impregnate, to procreate. And I think it's actually known that this verb exists, ladat, da'at. And so when we remember that and we read the Tree of Knowledge, it takes on a very different meaning, because now the fact that in the beginning of the story, the Bible finds it important to note that Adam and Eve were naked, and at the end of the story, to note that they have now become aware of their nakedness, immediately after the story, the next thing that really happens is that Eve becomes pregnant. In fact, it says that Adam knew his wife. So this verb, this sort of double meaning, as has been the case a lot, is really the key, I think, to understanding what's going on here. So, in order to do that, we're going to have to go further back a little bit in the Sumerian story to what we were talking about last week. And what was in this story was that Adam and Eve were first created, and they were allowed to work in Enki's realm in Africa. And it was later on that they were actually brought to the Garden of Eden. So what in the Bible is a very, very condensed story that really does seem to be lacking some kind of information, in the Sumerian tale is something that happens over a much longer period of time. So they arrive in the Garden of Eden and they're allowed to be there. But they were created 7 men and 7 women, and of them was the first 2, but it was actually 14 humans in the Garden of Eden at that time. And they were allowed to be together, and it was expected that they would procreate. But as we said last week, with hybrids, there's a very common problem that they can't procreate. And so the Anunnaki discovered this problem and realized that for these 14, once they reach an old age, they're going to have to keep on birthing more humans, because the process that it was done by was having the fertilized egg implanted in one of the Anunnaki female nurses, birthing goddesses, I think they were called. And that was obviously not an ideal situation. It was putting them at risk, and they were very much inclined to make this work. And it was for that reason, unbeknownst to Enlil, that Enki decided to do something about this. Now, I'm going to pause here very quickly before we carry on, because part of this show, part of what I'm doing here every week, I have to sort of select and edit and cut out a lot of the extra information and decide what's pertinent and important, and try and have it all into a cohesive tale, and hopefully have it clear and understandable enough so that even people who've never heard of these things will be able to follow. Now, in order to do that, I have minimized the Sumerian terms as much as possible. I try and put a word in here and there when it's crucial, but generally speaking, there's a lot of names and Sumerian names, the names of the different planets and the different characters, etc., etc. But I've tried to sort of keep it simple. And so I've minimized it more or less until now to be Enki, Enlil, and Anu. Anu being the king of Nibiru, who isn't on Earth. Enlil being the commander, younger to Enki, but first true born of both king and queen. And Enki being the scientist and hero. So at this point in the story, I have to introduce another character. Now, this is a very important character. We're not going to say his name too often because he has, I think, one of the more difficult names, Ninshgizida. You can look it up if you want. Maybe I'll type it up in chat. And Ninshgizida is the son of Enki. And if Enki is the hero of Sitchin's narrative, then Ninshgizida is the hero of Drunvalo Melchizedek's narrative. And so in the next section, we will actually be talking a lot more about his character. But for this story, we're going to keep it as simple as possible and only what's important. The important fact here, and we're going to come back to Ninshgizida again, is that it wasn't in fact Enki who managed to do the necessary upgrade to evolve humans. It was actually his son, Ninshgizida, and he helped with the process before as well, and he was also a scientist as Enki was, and he was taught by Enki and became a rather proficient scientist in his own right. So, okay, hang on. Before I go on, I saw that there were a few questions in chat, so I'm going to try and answer some of those. Eating from the tree of knowledge, yes. Yes. Okay, is he saying God put a naked man and woman together and explicitly told them not to get to know each other? If you're talking about the Old Testament, what's explained, what's told there is that they didn't know. So if we'll relate it for just a minute to one of the explanations, if this is describing an earlier period in human evolution, it's said that they weren't aware of their nakedness if they were sort of this truly pure, being that was born, that they simply didn't have the conscious mind. According to the explanation of Sitchin, the knowing is specifically about procreation, but in the Bible, it doesn't necessarily. And obviously, over the years, people have more often meant it to be some kind of wisdom or knowledge or awareness of some sort. So that's in terms of the Old Testament. Okay, do you have the English Gematria chart? I need the one that puts Fox as 66. I don't know much about English Gematria, I'm afraid. Patient Zero, as always. Thank you very much. Okay, so the whole tale, we won't go into it, but it involved Enki and two other Anunnaki having some kind of operation, some kind of, medical procedure that was quite invasive to take place. And so it was thanks to that this genetic upgrade, this new change was planted in Adam, in the first creation, Adamu, as his name was. And this was what changed man as a hybrid from being barren to actually being able to procreate. And so with this information in mind, when we reread the Old Testament, it suddenly takes on a very different meaning. And so instead of that, I'm actually going to post a bit of a long quote. So I apologize. We'll go through it for those who are listening at home as well. So this is actually a quote from the Lost Book of Enki. And this is Enlil wandering through the Garden of Eden, his home, expecting as usual to see the humans who are working, and suddenly finding that Eve was pregnant. The first woman who was given this gift of procreation. And so here's the quote: "Great was Enlil's anger, furious his words were. The whole thing was not to my liking, for acting as creators I had opposed." So in the beginning, when Enki first suggested the idea, Enlil was against it, saying part of his reasoning was that the Anunnaki shouldn't behave as creators. The being that we need, it already exists. So you, Enki, saying, all we need is put our mark on it, thereby primitive workers to fashion. Now the last bits of our life essence to these creatures you have given, to be like us in procreation knowing, perchance our life cycles on them to bestow. Thus the Lenin will with angry words speak. So here we meet this again, the tree of life, this idea that Enlil talks about, and we're going to come back to this idea time and time again because it actually plays a very big part, both in the story and in the continuation. But the different life cycles of the Anunnaki and humans, and basically the amount of time that humans were quote unquote allowed to live. And so we'll carry on with what Enki, Ninmah, who is another Anunnaki, and Nishkizida, are summoned, and they talk to Enlil. And they say, "What was the choice, my brother? To end it all in failure, Nibiru in doom to face its fate?" And so Enlil answers, and I think this is the crucial part, as it were, "Then let them be where they are needed." Enlil with anger said, "To the Abzu, away from the Eden, let them be expelled." And so, at this point, as we read in the end of the Old Testament, Enlil expels the humans from the Garden of Eden, from his place, and they are basically allowed to roam, not free, but outside, and to continue procreating and to continue spreading, as it were. And so, in the story, at this point, basically, there's a lot that's been going on. And so, in terms of the state of the Earth at this point, the climate seems to be changing. And this actually plays a big part in the future. We'll see when we actually get to it. But the situation on Earth is that the climate changes to worse. There are droughts and there are floods. And the state of basically both the Anunnaki and the humans on Earth is worsened. And so it is talked about as we said, there was a way station. And so the gold that was gathered on Earth was taken to Mars, and from Mars it was taken to Nibiru. So Mars was acting as a sort of stop-off point for both. And at this point, Enlil, because of the storms have been wreaking havoc on Mars, and the station there is unable to operate. So Enlil suggests, in order to boost production as well, to send the gold straight to Nibiru from Earth. And so Enki doesn't agree with this idea, and he suggests instead to try and use the moon. And the reason I'm bringing all of this up is because on the moon, something very interesting happens. So Enki actually takes his son, Marduk. He takes him to the moon with him, and they stay on the moon for a very, very long time. They have a long interaction there, and Enki studies the stars, and a lot happens. I can't remember the exact number, but we're talking about thousands of Earth years. So during this time, the humans are continuing to basically procreate, but their situation is getting worse. And yet, when the humans were first used by the Anunnakis to work, I'll tell you what, actually. As I was rereading the Lost Book of Enki, I saw this quote, and it was just so, I don't know, heartbreaking, I don't know, real, that I thought I really want to share it with you. And so, in this description, this is the Anunnaki describing how the human workers were. And it just seems to me to be such a, how should we say it, like external description. So, to be with the Anunnaki, they were eager. This is the humans. For food rations, they toiled well. Of heat and dust, they did not complain. Of backbreaking, they did not grumble. Of the hardships of work, the Anunnaki of the Abzu were relieved. And so, two things here. First of all, this is a very interesting description of workers, obviously, since it's the same tale, but it does seem to bear the markings of a new beast, a beast who is unaware of a lot of things and of the situation. As humans who are born into dire straits, we know that children will normalize and accept anything that happens. It's a very frightening situation, I think, to think about. But the other point is that the workers of the Anunnaki, the work of the Anunnaki of the Abzu were relieved. And so the Abzu was Africa, so this is only a certain part, and it was this point that was going on while Enki and Marduk were on the moon. And so the Anunnaki in the rest of the land and in the Garden of Eden didn't want to carry on with the work, because they saw that the Anunnaki in Africa were basically getting all of this help, and they demanded the same from Enlil, and it almost resulted in a mutiny. And in the end, because Enki wasn't there to satisfy, a son of Enlil took things into his own hands, and he was actually the one who freed the humans and brought them to the rest of Mesopotamia of that time, to all the land. So the human beings have been living in these situations, more or less, a lot of them working in the cities, some of them working in the fields, but a lot of them just sort of roaming around, as it were. And so it is during this time that they are still very much animal-like. And so, okay, this is setting up the scene, basically. Okay, let me just have one moment to look. Half an hour, okay, fine. So, Enki and Marduk come back from the moon after their investigations. Anu agrees to Enlil's suggestion to set up, to send the gold straight from Earth, and the human beings are working for the Anunnaki. The Anunnaki currently are sort of enjoying their help and being relieved of the work. And during all of this, the situation on Earth, climatically speaking, is worsening. Okay, so all of these pieces are in place. Now, it's next that something of monumentous importance happens. And this is when Enki is roaming around Africa, and he notices the humans who are around as sort of reverting back to their more animalistic ways. And he understands that it's through their procreation, which has now been happening for many generations, the Anunnaki DNA is weakened, and the ape man DNA is basically taking more dominance. And so at this point, Enki decides to do something which is both very much in his character and a crucial step in our human evolution. Enki notices two beautiful human women by a river as he goes with his boat. And as the story goes in the Lost Book of Enki, he invites the two women, and they conceive. And after Enki has his way with them, he is actually only escorted with his helper, and he tells his helper to keep this a secret and not to tell anyone about this. And to keep an eye on the two ladies. So after 9 months pass, the two women bear children, and the two children who are born are called Adapa and Tiamati. Now, their birth was actually done in secret, and it's said that if somebody asks his helper, Enki's helper, where the people came from, he's to say that he found them in a reed basket by the river. So that bears some similarities to another Old Testament story. Excuse me. So I'd like to post another quote here, and this is the description of the new people, the Earthlings, and how they were different. So, slower to grow up than Earthlings they were. Much quicker in understanding they were. With intelligence they were endowed. Of speaking with words capable they were. And so this is the description of Adapa and Tiamati, who were the first children of Enki, basically. Not the first, but the first human children of Enki. And we see here, so just to explain, slower to grow up than the Earthlings means that they aged less quickly. They stayed younger for longer. So that's closer to the Anunnaki cycle. The Anunnaki lifespan was more or less 3,000, no, sorry, I can't remember how many shahs, but thousands and thousands of years longer because of the Niburian cycle. And so the human cycle, although not that long, was longer than the other Earthlings. And we can see that they were very capable, much more than their previous counterparts. And so Enki and his wife, basically, who was in charge of these operations as well, took a keen fondness to these two and raised them not only as their own, but for the first time clothed them and taught them the different crafts and different skills, and were really creating the first civilized human beings. And so the name of the man, as we said, was Adapa. And it seems that what happens here is that the story in the Old Testament has both fused the two first humans, as it were, into one character. The first human ever created, Adamu, and the first civilized human being, Adapa, and told the tale of Adam and Eve as those two tales, because we see in the lost book of Enki, Adapa and Tiamati, the two civilized human beings, grow up, and it's said that the Anunnaki were very anxious to see if they were going to be able to procreate and to conceive, and so they were very excited when indeed Tiamati became pregnant, and she had twins. And as the twins were born, they came to be known as Cain and Abel. And most of us, I think, recall the story of Cain and Abel. And this seems to start the lineage of the biblical Adam, who we're told the generations lead to. So, something very important happens with Adapa. Obviously, he is a very curious development, first of his kind, Adapa and Tiamati, but I'm going to tell the story as it is, which is mostly talking about Adapa. I think a lot of the, well, not I think, but a lot of the patriarchy that we see seems to have originated from the Anunnaki's power system. So when Adapa had grown old and clothed and knowledgeable, etc., he was presented before the Anunnaki. And Enlil was immediately very suspicious and seems to be very sarcastically asking, "You just found them like this out there by the reed or whatever?" And so he obviously suspects or knows that Enki had a hand in this, as has been his MO throughout, advancing the humans much more than Enlil would think. But to a great surprise, Enlil actually presses Enki, and eventually the truth is told, but Anu is told of the situation as well. And Anu then decides to invite Adapa to Nibiru. And so this is the first time that anything like this has ever happened. The previous humans were much more ape-like than obviously intelligent enough to be able to be presented. And here Anu seems to be acting in a very unusual way. And what's interesting is that both Enki and Enlil are very much opposed to this idea. Now, it seems from the story, and we'll see, a big part of the Adam and Eve tale, and indeed this story, is this longevity, this immortality. So Sitchin has his third book, actually talks all about, I think it's his third, I can't remember, I think Stairway to Heaven, all about longevity and humanity's obsession with immortality throughout history, and the apparent evidence that we see to very, very few, but certain individuals being bestowed with the gift of life by God, as it is in the Old Testament, by the Anunnaki, as it is in the Sumerian or different Semitic tales. So this idea of immortality is, I think, it's less important for me, personally. I think it's a very interesting subject, and we'll get into it more in the further parts. But for now, it was a very big deal, as it were, for the people of that age. And what it was known as was the gods basically inviting a human to join them. This was all based, as it were, on this first human who was ever allowed, who was Adapa. And so before Adapa is brought to Anu, to Nibiru, he is coached by his father, Enki. And he's told a few things, and he's sort of, soothed as you would prepare a first of its species kind going to meet an alien on a different planet. It's hard to imagine. But he tells him something very specific, and he says, make sure you don't eat from the food that's offered, and you don't drink from the elixir that's offered to you. And so Adapa obviously agrees. And the other thing is that Enki tells his two half-brothers, basically, to escort him. His half-brothers, one of them being Ninshkizida, whom we recall from before, and the other being Dumuzi, who is a different character. But an interesting fact to remember is that at this point, Ninshkizida and Dumuzi were actually born on Earth. And so the first generation, Enki and Enlil, who landed on Earth, bore children, and some of those children were actually born on Earth who had never been to Nibiru, who had never met their grandfather, Anu. And so this sort of opportunity, both for Anu to meet them, Enki seems to think it's a good idea for them to escort, but secretly he is actually sending them to make sure that Adapa, is okay, obviously, to escort him, but also that he doesn't eat or drink from the food and the drink. And the question is, as Enki answers, why would he insist not to eat or drink? And the meaning is very clearly stated. If Adapa were to eat from the food, he would have eternal life. And so it seems, as Anu was aware of this, that Anu was interested in giving the human an eternal life, and basically, I think, inviting him to live as one of the Anunnaki. And Enki and Enlil both can't accept that at all. So Enki finishes prepping Adapa, and his brothers come and get into the spaceship. And the tale that's told is of Adapa being terrified of the loud, noise as they lift, and it's told of seeing the Earth getting smaller and smaller until it's disappeared. And it's said that he starts panicking and pleading his brothers to take him back, and that he doesn't want to carry on. And it said that Ninshkizida is actually forced to. The direct quote, I think, is place his hand on his shoulder, and the Adapa fell asleep, but somehow to put him at ease, as it were. And so they arrive, and Adapa and the others meet Anu, and the exchange is obviously very important and ceremonial, and Adapa is then told to return to Earth. And so when Adapa returns, humanity's status in general, this new being who is civilized and intelligent, it actually changes quite drastically. And at this point, after Enlil had first expelled humans from the Garden of Eden, they are now allowed back into that area, into Mesopotamia, into the Garden of Eden where they first were. And it's in this place that the first city and the first civilization are established, basically. So this is a very obviously important event, and this is the beginning of all of the characteristics that we recognize as modern humans, not in the sense of technology, but in the sense of the people who are like us, the Homo sapiens, the actual artists and painters, etc. All of this culture was started in that first city, and that first city we know was called Sumer. I think it was actually called Shumer, and in Hebrew it's called Shin'al in the Bible, and in Sumerian it's pronounced differently. So I don't know, but in the Anunnaki's language, but for us we're going to refer to it as Sumer. So let's see, how much time do we have? 17 minutes. Okay, are there any questions first before we continue? Let me have a look in chat because I haven't seen yet. I've got a little bit more, but okay. Yes, warp speed definitely does weird things. Okay, so let me go a little bit further, and we'll open up the subject and continue next week. So in this point, the relationship between people and humans and the Anunnaki changes from the humans being really seen by everyone as work animals, as beasts, to actually being, as is said, in the likeness of the Anunnaki, resembling them enough to actually be civilized and be taught. And so at this point, instead of just working for the gods, there is a new term that we find introduced, and that's worshipping. And this word, worshipping gods, is interesting because in the Old Testament, the actual term in Hebrew is avodah, and that means work. So the work of God, which is a term that we know very well. The origin of this, the worshipping as work, is from this first city where the relationship was established between the humans who were looking up to and worshipping the gods and bestowing the gifts of the land and doing everything that we know, and basically being the workers that sustained both themselves and the Anunnaki. So when we look at the model of this first city, we see the very, very common patterns that we see in the power structures today as well. And these are all seem to be based what's known as the sort of Eastern monarchy, the Eastern kingship, which was a leader who was ordained by the gods, who was sort of spiritually advanced, having a class of priests who were the interpreters, the specialists, and these two classes, as it were the mediators of the God's will to the people. Now, in this, obviously, in today's world and with our history and everything that we know, this idea has been abused, warped, and used to manipulate so many people that it's easy to think of it as nothing more than a scam. But its origins in Sumer seem to point to the fact that the humans who were worshipping the gods and angering them and in a very lively relationship with them were actually living these things much more honestly than we know. And so we see a lot of the power structures that we suffer from today originate in this first city and the cities that will follow. And so we're going to touch on this theme again and again as humanity develops. But for now, I want to talk about something else. At this point, there's another very important step that happens. So once Enki has slept with those two women, it is basically understood as was there dead air? Was everyone hearing the stream okay? Let me know if there are any audio problems. Once the Anunnaki realized that they could sleep with the humans, the new humans, something changed. And as we see, oh dear, hang on, let me see if I got anything to do with it. Okay. Well, we've got about 13 minutes. Yep. So, okay, nice. So I'll just carry on with this. When the Anunnaki realized it, that was what opened up what we have seen in the beginning, which is that the sons of God saw the female humans and they were beautiful in their eyes. This is the situation that humanity has reached, where there are multiple generations of Anunnaki on Earth, and there are multiple generations of humans, and these later generations are basically more willing to procreate together. And this leads to, let's say, a lot of, I think, the mythologies that we know and the sons of gods and the mixing and half gods, etc., seem to originate from this very specific time where there was all of this promiscuity on the side of the gods, obviously. But this also seems to be something even more important, I think, in the history of humanity. And that is that I think this is where we find the original, instigators of xenophobia and racism, things that we still see around us today. I think for most people, at least, I hope my listeners, when we think of race, it seems so ludicrous, as it were. It's not really based on anything valid in our real life, and the categories so blurred. And obviously, a lot of us can remember or think about the Second World War as being, with eugenics, one of the more proliferators. It doesn't matter about the subject, but if we think about the xenophobia in the time of the Anunnaki, with the gods and the humans being together, here we see a very different mix of races. This is actually a mix of species, as it were. And so with this interspecies relationships, first of all, this species used to be a beast only a few generations ago, so it's less intelligent, it's less capable than the Anunnaki. We can understand how these things could, for the Anunnaki, from their point of view, even come close to being something along the lines of bestiality. because this being who is their creation is not aware of the situation as they were. And so this is, there is Enki, who seems to find no problem and in fact sees it as the key to the evolution of humanity. But at the same time, let's say Enlil is playing the other card. And Enlil always sees humanities not only as inferior, as we've seen, but as a danger to the Anunnaki, both in giving them the ability to procreate and then with the fear of giving them longevity. And it seems almost more than anything else, the fear of the Anunnaki race mixing with the human race. And so that is the point. Okay, yes, that is the point that I think we'll end this episode on. We've got 10 more minutes. Excellent. Let me go through chat. So next week, we've finally made it. Wow, I'm so excited. I thought this was going to be 2 episodes ago, but as I was going through the Lost Book and seeing all of the information, it seems very hard to sort of take away too much of it. So it took us a little while, but we've finally come to next week, which is going to be the story of the flood, one of the greatest myths ever told, and indeed another very crucial turning point in humanity's history. So we'll talk about that more next week. For now, let me just see. Oh, I've jumped up. If there's anything in chat that I've missed. Okay. You humans well, technically speaking, we are all Anunnaki. So it's quite strange, and I had a conversation about this, but for me personally, I'm not going to tell anyone how you're viewing this. Obviously, for most, it will be something at least fantastical, if not mythical. But for me personally, I do view these things as part of our origin story, and with it, the effect. So I think we've seen it in films a lot of times where someone is suddenly becomes aware of their past or something they didn't know, etc., etc. So obviously on an evolutionary scale, it's very different. But still, I think we all grew up on this tale of not just being part of the evolution and part of Earth, but being something special and unique and being something that was sort of, destined to be here, as it were. And all of these notions, I think, of anthropocentric self-importance, when hearing these stories and having yourself taken from the hero of the story to actually one of the sort of side characters, as it were, for the Anunnaki at least, it's a difficult position, I think, to deal with, at least for me. But I don't know, just so much of it. I mean, obviously the physical evidence help a lot, and if it wasn't something that many people have sort of pointed to, it would be a lot harder for me to just accept. But really and truly, once I started seeing our history and seeing humanity and seeing the power structures and the paradigms that have basically controlled and governed humanity over the last 10,000 years, this story, this narrative of an alien race with power struggles and, patriarchy and oppression and all of these different things coming to Earth and manipulating genetics and creating this really unique species, it just seems to answer more questions than it raises for me personally. So yeah, I don't know. I guess we'll see in future. But yeah, so technically I am part Anunnaki, probably very, very distant. It's great to see you here, Ganja Farmer. I think, is this the first time you've joined the show? Thank you very much for being here. Yes. I don't know what your tribe is, but the same historical mystery for the North American people. Sitchin in his books goes over most of the world. I have to say that a lot of Asia, specifically the north of Asia, he doesn't deal with. And I think, So yeah, what we're trying to do here is we're trying to cover it all. We're trying to cover as much of history as we can and as many different cultures as we can. So obviously the cultures around Mesopotamia are all interlinked, and it's much easier to connect the dots. How do you get from Mesopotamia to South America, North America, to Australia is another matter, and yet Sitchin seems to have done just that to a certain extent. And then we have the other researchers. And so Gerald Clark does amazing work with tracing through different cultures and different civilizations across continents, the gods and their workings and the effects that it had on humanity. So really and truly, in my mind at least, these stories and these narratives are answering, that's the thing, a lot of different mysteries from all sorts of different places all over the world. And so many of them seem to be very much in agreement. These tales of the gods, the gold, the smelting of it, a lot of these points, ziggurats and pyramids, and a lot of things that I'm not talking about here purposely. But if you go deep into these things and really have the lateral research, you start to see a lot of different dots being connected. So yeah, I mean, North America, South America, Europe, obviously, Africa, all of those were sort of key players in the first 7 books, I think. And then with the Hindu Valley and India and with China, he does talk about it a little bit, but there are other researchers who are more prolific about those areas. Anti-Commie Blood said, just imagine the many levels of history not known just in the last 2,000 years. Absolutely. I was just talking about this with a friend of mine, and most of the knowledge, not just lost in history, but actually destroyed. The Christian crusades, possibly, more than the lives they took, was actually the knowledge and the culture the cultures that they destroyed on their paths, something that we can obviously never get back. And with the story of the Ark, we go into that also, where because so little of this is known and so little of this has survived 6,000 years, not 10,000 years or 50,000 years, we have to be very sort of patient with what we find, because we are not blessed with the adequate evidence that has obviously been in existence in history. And therefore, if we get one clay tablet that mentions one thing, one verse or whatever, we need to be able to glean as much of the information as we can from that. And I think that's exactly what Sitchin does, and specifically the Lost Book of Enki. He really does put all of the work and all of his research and tries to marry it and put it all together into one cohesive story, which is the history of humanity. So I'm very appreciative. Whether it's 100% accurate, I would assume not. And obviously, we'll get into some things that I disagree with Sitchin in further future segments. But for now, I certainly think it's a very, very interesting perspective. But let's remember, as I keep saying time and time again, this is the perspective of Enki. And so again, he is the hero. He's going to be portrayed in the positive light. The stories of Enlil portray Enlil in a positive light. The stories of Marduk portray him in the positive light. And a lot of these stories are retold with each of these gods playing the hero according to the culture. So that's why I think it's less important to be too caught up in the characters and who each one is, and more be able to see the overall story of what happened. Okay, that's it from me. Thank you everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure, and join me next week for another episode of the Discomfort-Zone podcast.